Hello and welcome back to the KCC channel. I'm Rob and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today I have 5 stories for you from the Tales from the SquadCar subreddit. Before we start that, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It's completely free and you can always change your mind later. Alright, on to the stories. Let's jump right in. This story comes to us from Sammy Gam G. Drunk decides to be a butthead, earns 2+ weeks in jail instead of 0. Y'all liked my last story, so I thought I'd tell another that happened recently. This is the tale of Jose, a man who allowed pride to get the best of him. Pride and booze. Officer Sleepy is on his way back to the substation to end his shift. The last thing he wants is to get tied up with nonsense when he's about to head home. But when Officer Sleepy sees Jose driving like he's blindfolded, he does the right thing and pulls him over. As soon as the window opens, Officer Sleepy gets blasted in the face by the smell of beer. Jose is looking cross-eyed, can barely say the alphabet or count to save his life. Officer Sleepy runs Jose through SFSTs. Jose is confused why he had to keep doing more tests. He's certain he nailed every one. Spoiler alert, he did not. Officer Sleepy places Jose under arrest for one of the most obvious OVIs of his career. Jose is deeply indignant. He's not a criminal. He doesn't have pew-pews. He did all the tests perfectly. He's done nothing wrong. Now, here's the thing you need to know about many big city agencies, including the one for which Officer Sleepy works. People arrested for OVIs are almost never taken to jail the night of their arrest anymore. They're given a court date and taken someplace safe. Officer Sleepy asks Jose for his information. Jose decides he's not going to go with the program and lies. He says he's the registered owner of the car. Unfortunately for Jose, police can actually look up DMV photos and clearly see that's not him. Officer Sleepy asks what his real name is. Jose stays silent. Officer Sleepy gives Jose one more chance. If you give us your ID info, you will go home tonight with a ticket and a court date. But if you do not ID yourself as required by law, we will charge you with failing to ID. And I promise that you will spend the weekend in jail. And we will ID you anyway. Well, Jose is too proud or drunk or stupid or some combination thereof and decides, that's fine, take me to jail. I'll spend 2 or 3 days in there, no problem. Officer Sleepy took Jose to the ID unit to have him fingerprinted, where his name and info was discovered. After spending hours there and finishing paperwork, Jose was slated in jail about 4 hours after the traffic stop. About 3 hours after Officer Sleepy was supposed to leave for home. Well, despite being a big city where many people are released on recognizance bonds, even for violent crimes, apparently the court is not happy with Jose either for some reason. He was arraigned and given a large bond, which he could not pay. Jose is spending his 17th day in jail as I write this. He has court again soon, where he may be released, if perhaps he can show a bit of humility before the judge. In the end, all he had to do was give up his name, and he wouldn't have even spent a single night in jail. Part of me wants to see him again, so I can ask him if it was worth it. Officer Sleepy, out of service. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called Megazak. It says, imagine when you see him again, he says that he's met another Jose since he's gotten out of jail, and that they've bonded, and he's doing a lot better now. And then he pulls out a bottle of Jose Cuervo, takes a swig, and then drives off. OP responded to this one and said, well, that's the double Jose immunity rule. That's why I had to let a guy named Johnny Walker go the other day, even though he was destroyed. Another commenter down below called JBuckets44 said, had Jose ID'd himself to you promptly, what would have happened to his car? And how would he have gotten home given that he was too drunk to drive still? OP responded to this one and said, his car would have still been impounded. Then I would probably have just driven him home. Alternatively, I can take him to a friend or family member to look after him. Someone can pick him up. He can take a cab or Uber home. I can take him to get a hotel room for the night close by. Or a last resort before jail is usually to leave someone at the hospital. Someplace I know they won't die if I leave them there. It's interesting how the regulations are very different in different places because I know where I am. If you get pulled over for drunk driving, you are going directly to jail. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. You're getting locked up. It's actually quite sad for me to hear that there's so many people locked up down there that they just take people home for drunk driving. There could be a lot of people killed by somebody driving a car under the influence. It just doesn't make sense. This story comes to us from Deputy Dan 791, Tony Romo, and the Lizard King. My first few years in law enforcement, I worked at a sheriff's office in Florida with about 350 sworn deputies. We had a mixture of rural and urban areas and a large city police department that was around the same size as us, as well as several 20-man city departments for the smaller towns in the county. I was also in a college town, so occasionally we had some effed up calls with those idiots. I'm working patrol one night and it's the usual fare for a Saturday: domestics, shots fired, and traffic problems and street racing. My shift had a ritual. When it got around 4:30 or so, a few of us who weren't tied up would go to this 24-hour breakfast joint and do our reports at a table in the back room and shoot the crap. This night, I had a trainee who was pretty legit. He was doing well, was in 4th phase, which is essentially the "I'm here for backup, handle your crap" phase. As soon as I ordered my chocolate chip pancakes, we heard the dreaded beep 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 tone that means either something serious is happening or a citizen heard a possum outside and called in that they were being burgled. My trainee jumps out of his seat and hauls butt towards the car. So I'm like, well, I guess we are going to take this one, whatever it is. Callers reported a man running northbound in the southbound lanes of a major highway. There's several more calls asking us to step it up because there's already one single vehicle crash. We get on scene and I'm looking around and everything seems pretty normal at first, until I catch some movement in my peripheral vision in the bushes by the Howard Johnson. I shine my flashlight across the road and I see a flash of skin. I start carefully making my way across the road and I see a head poking out of the bushes. I challenge him and my trainee pulls his taser and starts shrieking in a high-pitched voice for him to get out of the bushes. The guy says, "I can't because Tony Romo." I get closer and now can see he's sitting Indian style in the bushes. He's also very, very naked and sweaty. We try to coax him out of the bushes and he jumps up and yells, "I am the Lizard King," and starts sprinting down the sidewalk and into the highway again. He takes off wearing nothing but tennis shoes and not a stitch else. My trainee looks at me like shrug and I'm like, go get him, he's gonna get killed. So he chases the guy down with me behind him and tackles the dude in the median and cuffs him up. By this time, the entire shift is there because they heard there was a naked dude, even the supervisors. It's also 5 a.m. now and we get up at 6 a.m, so I'm pissed. We sit the dude down in the median, cuffed in front, because he's obviously not dangerous after interacting with him, and he's picking things off the ground and eating them, and talking about how Tony Romo is one of the Illuminati, and how he's one of the lizard overlords. He wasn't just sweaty either, he was covered in some sort of lubricant and smelled like solvent. I talk to the lieutenant and I'm like, this dude ain't gonna be accepted in the jail, the nurse will laugh us out of the place. He's like, yeah, what do you think? I'm like, hospital, 100%, let them deal with this. Put him in the back of my car and we take him to the ER. Security is glaring at us as we bring this naked dude wearing a blanket we keep for people in shock, place him on a 72-hour mental health hold, and take off. My trainee looks hollow-eyed like he's seen a ghost. I'm like, dude, first naked guy? He's like, yep, hopefully last naked guy. Naked dude gets admitted and I'm only 45 minutes late getting off. Turns out he was on substances and had covered himself in a mixture of gasoline and KY jelly. Not the strangest call I had that week. That story is for another time. It involved burglars supposedly breaking into a man's house and whacking him in his sleep, and we're not talking about death here. And also planting cameras on his horde of cockroaches that were literally living with him in his house. So after we found out what this guy was covered in, I was kind of sitting back and going, haha, good thing they didn't use the taser, that guy would have gone up in a puff. I wonder if after tackling this guy, trainee had to go home and change into a different uniform. You'd think he'd be covered in that stuff too, and that would be absolutely nasty. This story comes to us from Sammy Gamgee. What not to do before fleeing. Let's call him Jim. Jim ran a red light. Jim got pulled over. Jim is polite and respectful. Jim hands over his ID, insurance, provides his current address and phone number. Jim's lady friend in the front seat even hands over her ID unprompted. Officer runs Jim. Jim has a warrant for petty theft from a neighboring jurisdiction. Officer returns to Jim and tells him he has a warrant and needs to step out of the car. Jim says, "What? I have a warrant?" Then proceeds to put his car in gear and take off, with 2-year-old Jim Jr. in the back seat without a car seat. Luckily for Jim, the agency pursuit policy prevents officers from following him. Unlucky for Jim, officers now know exactly who he is and where he lives. Officers proceed to file warrants for 6 charges against Jim. The warrants also serve to trigger an automatic violation of his probation. The funny thing is, there was only a $300 bond on the petty theft charge. He probably would have been released immediately if he could pay it. The even funnier thing is, that warrant was no longer even in NCIC the next day, meaning it probably wouldn't have even been good. He would have been handcuffed, the warrant verified, and if no good, released immediately. The next day, Jim's lady friend called asking for her ID. Sorry lady, it was mailed to the DMV. But she confirmed that the address Jim so kindly provided was a good one. A couple hours later, the officers from whom Jim fled paid him a visit. Now Jim is in jail, serving the remainder of his previously suspended 180 days for the probation violation, plus whatever the new charges bring. Jim is dumb. Don't be like Jim. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called Marcus B. It says, "Reading stories here and watching police pursuit videos has convinced me that running away would be a bad option for me. It just makes whatever problem I have worse." Another commenter down below called Sarcastic Beach Girl said, "Let's be honest here. Most criminals aren't the best and brightest to begin with. Making good choices hasn't been high on their list of priorities. And thankfully, those choices keep me employed." You know you're definitely not thinking clearly when you've given all your information to an officer and then you decide that you can get away from them. I wonder if Jim was trying to get onto an episode of America's Dumbest Criminals. This story comes to us from No Resignation. Passenger in suspect's car. I've always wondered what a cop would say that I should have done differently. It was shortly after the start of a first date, blind date set up by a new work colleague. He was driving us to the restaurant. I have no idea why specifically he fled. He just told me he was wanted and took off. This was a couple decades ago. I didn't have a cell phone. I was in my early 20s and naive, and I'd only recently moved to San Francisco and didn't know the city at all. They pursued. He lost them during a terrifying chase by suddenly ducking down a residential street, pulling into an empty driveway, turning off the motor, and pushing me to the floor and then laying on top of me with his hand over my mouth. I saw several sets of lights go by several times, and we laid there for a long time before he let me up. He said he wasn't afraid I'd scream, that he'd only put his hand over my mouth so I wouldn't hyperventilate and fog the windows, which made me think this wasn't the first time he'd run. I considered jumping out of the car and banging on someone's door, but I had no idea where I was or what kind of neighborhood it was. And then he said he'd been really scared of getting caught because he had a pew-pew under the seat. I asked him to take me home, and amazingly, he did. I never heard from him again. My work colleague claimed he never saw him again either, and that he didn't know why he was wanted, though they'd been high school buddies. During the chase, I was far more frightened that we'd crash or hit someone than I was of being caught, because I didn't know what he'd done, and I was totally naive about police interactions. Since then, I've seen enough footage of police chases and read enough news stories to feel fear for anyone who is an unwilling or unwitting passenger in a chase. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called Agreeable Pie. It says, "Once you are in that position, I don't know anything you can or should have done safely. It's a very dangerous situation no matter what. And, for better or worse, a lot of police departments don't engage in vehicle pursuits anymore, unless it's for criminal activity, not just a citable driving offense. I suppose that getting out and trying to escape would have been the lesser of two evils, given what he had already done to you, even in a bad neighborhood. I would like my chances away from someone like that, but I'm glad that it didn't go worse. I hope that most women realize it's a better idea not to depend on strange men for transport on the first date. But the fact that you were set up on this date, not using Tinder or whatever, somewhat reduces that impulse. I've never been in a situation like that, but it's easy to sit back and think about what you would do in that case, even though you don't really know what you'd do in that case. I think I would jump out of that car and run like crazy, away from it as far as I could. Because if the police caught up with him again, and he decided he was going to fire at them, you could end up dead. I think I'll take my chances trying to get away. This story comes to us from Two Blue Zebras, a tale of two troopers. The way my state academy works is that you don't get to decide where you go when you graduate. The department decides where to send you for the first year, and you get to be happy you have a job. Typically, that means most people get sent to the cities. There are always a few spots in the rural areas, but they're rare since there's no people, and thus less need for cops. The result is troopers with very different experiences. I worked alongside a guy who had double my experience. He had around 20 years on. I was sent to a big city with a high crime rate when I graduated. He was sent to the middle of nowhere. We ended up transferring to a new place at around the same time. While getting coffee one morning, he casually said, "Most cops don't pull their pew-pews very often. I've only had to draw mine out a couple of times." I replied, "That can't be right." "Yeah, maybe once or twice." "No way, man." He nodded as I stared at him in disbelief. "What about high risk and felony stops? It's policy that we draw our pew-pews." "Yeah, I've only done a couple of those." I shook my head in disbelief. I did that my first week. There were times I was pulling my pew-pew multiple times a day. Heck, 2 days before I transferred here, I was hunting down 4 people who committed robbery, and I had my big pew-pew out when I found 2 of them. Well, yeah, I didn't have to do anything that crazy. We also get commendations for good driving. Every 5 years we go without crashing a car. From scraping a curb to rolling a car over, we get another commendation. He told me, "I've never crashed a car." "Really? In 20 years? "Yeah, why? You have?" "Yeah, I've been in a bunch of crashes. All super slow, but still. It was basically expected you'd get into a crash every other year or so. There's too much traffic, and we're trying to get places super fast." "You must just suck at driving. You just drove in an area where there wasn't anything to hit." I can kind of relate to the story, but not from the police side. See, when I lived in Saskatchewan, I lived in a really big town. And one time, I had to go pick up a friend in a really small northern town that was just a little blip on the map. I walked into the little restaurant that he was sitting in, and every pair of eyes in that restaurant was on me. Like, "You're not from here." It was just such a huge contrast for me, because if you walked into a store in one of the bigger cities there, people would go out of their way to not make eye contact with you. Did you know every single KCC video is also produced in podcast form? Just search for Karma Comment Chameleon on every major podcasting platform. I thank you for watching and listening. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.